welcome to the Tasmanian Timber webinar. We've got a few participants online. We're still waiting for a few more registrants. So we'll just give it another minute until the official kickoff time, and then we'll get underway. I will share. Alrighty. So let's get underway. Today's webinar, Tas Timber webinar, is native and plantation timbers, the sustainability of our forestry and supply. So we've got two presenters with us today. So David White is the Forest Manager at Sustainable Timber Tasmania, which is a GBE and manages 812,000 hectares of public production forest. Dave is from Canada, where he studied forestry at the University of British Columbia, and then he has been in Tasmania for the past 16 years working in our forests. He leads a team of foresters who do both short and long-term planning across both native and plantation estates, so he's very well placed to give an overview of the differences between the two. And looking at native forest regeneration, plantation supply to meet the long-term timber needs of timber specifiers. Michael Lee, who, if you've been on one of our webinars before, you'll be very familiar with. He's got 40 plus years experience in Tasmania's timber industry. He's the technical manager for the Tasmanian Timber Campaign, has spent many years at the Centre for Sustainable Architecture with Wood at the University of Tasmania, doing technical research into timber, and he answers the expert timber helpline for the campaign. So he's the person that you get when you have questions about timber before specifying, after specifying. He's your man, and he's there to answer any of your questions. The other thing to note before we kick off is that Dave, who is joining us today, is also a previous participant on the Original Thinkers podcast. So for anybody who's been following our podcast series, you may have heard that episode with Dave, and if not, I highly recommend it. It is the most downloaded episode we've ever had, and he talks through native forestry, regeneration, how those practices work, why they're so critical to having healthy forests, and answers questions around old growth forestry, certification, and the types of things that you might hear about in the media and have questions about. So well worth a listen. It's on the Tas Timber website under podcasts, and if you haven't already, well worth a listen. So today we're going to cover forestry and how that the process works. In Dave's podcast, one of the very famous quotes is that his old wildlife professor used to say, forestry is not rocket science, it's way more complex than that. So he'll give you some insight into that today. But quality follows management. So timber quality really is a direct response to the way that forest is managed, which is why Dave's role is so critical. Then Tasmania's two estates, our native forest public estate and our plantation estate, which is primarily fibre, but we also have in Tasmania an exception to that, which is a plantation estate that has been managed for sawlog and high quality timber production. Having a look at certification and the regulation system around native and plantation forestry, how the management differs, the environmental impacts of the different types of forestry, and then critically why we need both. So it's certainly not a case, as often is put forward, that we can use plantation forestry instead of native. We definitely need both if we're going to continue to have a supply of timber for specification. And then Mick's going to really have a good look at specifying plantation hardwood in particular. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dave, who's going to start talking about forestry and the two estates and how they're managed. So over to you, Dave.
Great. Thanks, Claire, for that introduction. I'll just sort of refine that. I'm the forest operations manager for the southern region, so I'm not quite as high up on the totem pole as maybe the introduction suggested. But what it does mean is I am on the pointy end in terms of growing and harvesting trees. So if there's any questions around that throughout the presentation, certainly happy to tackle that. Bear with me, I haven't prepared these slides, but I'm certainly prepared to talk to them as best I can. Uh, so forestry, the title of this one is Forestry is Complicated and the Debate Isn't, and that's absolutely correct in terms of the fact that uh, I think a lot of the discussion in the public forum around forestry is all about reducing it to sound bites. And look, probably like architecture, the devil is very much in the detail. And so different trees are grown for different products. Different management regimes produce different kinds of products, and that can be solid wood, or it can be pulp, or it can be things in between, like peeled logs that turn into plywood. Uh, a lot of discussion is around sort of plantation versus native forest. It's worth noting that there are different timescales associated with that. I think like fine wine, native forestry takes time, but you get a sort of a higher quality, denser, more slow grown product. But equally, you can turn around and produce a lot of biomass very quickly in a plantation environment. So it's different strokes for different folks. And with different markets, there's different ways for a forester to respond about what they choose to grow and how quickly and under what regimes that they want to grow it on. Here in southern Tasmania, we've got a fairly dispersed plantation environment. And so it's basically scattered in and amongst our native forest environment, our production native forest landscape. That in itself means that you've got to maintain things like roads and bridges to access all the estate. It's not just a case of segregating, a small portion of the forest to one side. And if you're inclined to lock up native forestry, for example, that all that would be on the other side of the fence. It's just not the case. They're all sort of intermixed and in the same sort of area. Probably next slide, Claire. Uh, so there's a couple distinctions, I guess, in the plantation environment. One is uh, there's two sort of products you can go for. One is growing timber for sort of fiber, and really what that boils down to is growing it for chemistry in one sense. Pulping to turn, when you turn a log into chips, pulping is a chemical process before it gets turned into paper or cardboard. And so you're actually managing for the chemical properties in the tree, not necessarily the stability of a piece of wood or its durability. Whereas if you're growing for something that you want to turn into sawn material, you're sort of thinking a bit differently about how you manage things like knots. And so you might prune the tree to produce clearwood, for example, but that in itself involves an investment in money. Whereas if you're just growing things for fiber, there's not as much care and maintenance associated with the stand. They both produce different commodities and they both produce it on different timelines. Pulp you can grow a lot quicker. Plantation, even though it's a lot quicker than native forest, you probably want to grow it a bit longer than a pulp crop. Um, and the bottom line says it pretty quickly. It's neither superior. It's just they're different products for different markets. Yeah. that picture there that you just put up, Claire, that sort of sums up what plantation forestry is. Essentially, it's a stand of uniform sort of every tree is sort of like the next one. That's the whole idea. And to pass that along to the manufacturing part of the sector, that's actually quite desirable because it makes for an efficient processing, regardless of if you're processing it for pulp or peeling it or sawing it. You're constantly just dealing with one piece size, so your run rate can be quite efficient, which is of advantage to somebody trying to move wood through their system. Next slide.
The other thing on this slide, Dave, is you can see on the left, that's a pulp log. So it's very small diameter, whereas the one on the right has been grown specifically as a saw log, so for a lot longer. So the diameter of the tree is much larger.
That's correct. So, I mean, in a pulp environment, you can go down to sort of that 20, 15 centimeter kind of area or smaller. Whereas really with sawing technology, we're starting to press the envelope, or sorry, processors are starting to press the envelope and are heading towards that 25, 20 centimeter small end diameter. But something like the piece in the right hand side is a lot easier and gives them a lot more options. And there's a few technical aspects to that, which include quarter sawing, which I won't get into, but I'm happy to talk about that later if people have questions. So I think really the important thing around plantation to recognize is there's a lot more investment, but it's because you get a return on investment because of the short-term nature of the rotation or of the crop. There's been a huge amount of effort put into, and this is global, by the way, but certainly we piggyback in Tasmania on that technology in terms of genetics and breeding, and you breed for certain things. So just like a farmer might breed certain animals for certain aspects, or a dog breeder breeds for certain aspects, so do tree people. And again, getting back to my earlier comments about either breeding for the chemistry of the tree for a pulp log environment or breeding for a solid wood kind of product and how it would behave both while it grows, but also when you cut it down. Um, the decisions that you have to make are fairly early on. So, even at 25 years out from a harvest, you've got to start doing things like pruning. And the slide there talks about pruning at age 3, and that's true. That's when you do your first lift, but then you've got to commit. So every year or every few years, you're sort of removing all the branches, just so there's a bit of a like a lollipop top of green leaves at the top of each tree, but you're removing all the knots, and so effectively you get a clear wood regime. So in architect world, you would have seen things in Australia like Baltic pine. Yep. Okay, I'll answer that question, Michelle. Michael, that's a good one. Things like Baltic pine, you typically see knots in it, but with hardwood, it doesn't dry particularly well when it's got knots in it, and so you want a knot-free kind of timber, and that's why you prune. It's a lot easier to handle. The other step that you'll take is a thinning, and what that does is it condenses the site resources into preferred stems. So at a certain point, you accelerate the removal of competition. Thinning happens naturally in a native forest environment. It just happens over decades. But because plantation is a short rotation prescription, you need to intervene and sort of accelerate these processes. And yep, sort of in doing so, you can actually end up with a saw log that, is similar. It's not the same, but it's similar to a native forest saw log that you might get in 60 or 80 years. You can do one in 30 years. It just has different properties, that's all. And then the processing of particularly plantation wood is an ongoing is an ongoing and constantly sort of researched approach to approach to what you can do and what you can get away with, and that includes sawing patterns and drawing techniques. And people are constantly playing in that space and trying to improve their ability to recover the maximum amount of solid timber uh, from increasingly smaller and smaller logs as well. So there's just an ongoing body of research there, and that'll continue well into the future. The question I saw that popped up on the screen was around, I think if I understood it correctly, genetically modifying trees. That's not quite exactly what we do. Generally, the tree breeding programs are about picking the seed from certain trees that we thought we liked, and then recombining it with other trees that we liked and grew, and because they had certain properties. It's not playing with the DNA at sort of some microscopic level, if that sort of answers the question. It's all about looking at what tree grew well and in the right form, and then taking those genetics and trying to combine them with other trees' genetics. So it's we STT here actively runs we run orchards, seed orchards, and that's how we do it. So it's a long and invested process. We'll spend decades growing and harvesting various types of seed off of trees that we believe are have the properties that we're chasing for the various products. But there's no manipulation of DNA or anything like that going on. Just, I mean, the stats are there for you guys to read. But fundamentally, there's 3.3 million hectares of forest on an island, 6 million hectares. Of that, 91% the forested area is native. 281,000 of that is production forest, and another 1.26 million hectares is in public reserve. So I think the message there is production forest is really just a small component of the forested area in Tasmania. So recognizing that plantations, if you're growing for pulp or sort of looking to harvest in that 20 to 30-year range, possibly more closer to the 20-year, decisions about what got planted actually happened 20 years ago. So, in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think, a lot of people had that vision of a pulp sort of market. And look, that continues to be a very strong market. But things like, if you can imagine the amount of people that ship by Amazon or whatnot, internet shopping, there's a whole bunch of cardboard that's moving around the globe now, for example. Um, but it's worth noting that even though plantations might have been grown for fiber and grown for their chemical properties, that hasn't actually stopped processors in Tasmania and in Australia from looking at it 20 years on and going, well, hold on a sec. Maybe we can actually, if we process it this way, we might be able to actually turn it um, into a solid wood product as well. And so just because 20 years ago someone thought they were planting something for pulp in a plantation regime, uh, it turns out, people are constantly asking questions and looking at opportunities. What you plant the tree for today might not necessarily be what the tree gets used for going down the road. And to the extent that we've got some interesting mass land projects that are, in fact, taking timber from what probably was grown in the spirit of planting a plantation for pulp and turning it into solid wood product, it's worth taking comfort in it that people are still constantly looking for the highest and best use of trees when it's grown. So that said, uh, that the bulk and look, the bulk is private that would have grown for pulp. STT set out on a path of and I think if we're not the only one, we're one of very, very few people that did set out on a pruned and thinned plantation estate. So the mandate for Forestry Tasmania at the time, which is now STT, was that there would be no conversion of native forest post 2007. So we're actually entering into this era where we've got a whole heap of plantation that's just coming online, and that has been um, pruned and thinned. So what I mean by pruning, if it's not obvious, is basically someone comes along with a set of shears and trims off the branches. And then a couple of years later, they come back with a ladder and prune some branches higher, trim off some branches. And then a couple of years later, they come back and do a third lift up to just a little over 6 meters. And in that time, there might be a couple thinning regimes. We might do a non-commercial thin, which is basically just killing suppressed trees in and amongst the stand. Or there might be a commercial thin where we actually recover volume, usually for pulp, in and amongst with a harvesting machinery. And what that does is it then puts all the site resources back into the uh, existing pruned and thinned trees. So the idea being all the sunlight, all the water, all the nutrients go into your winter trees, the ones that are sort of managed for high quality clear wood. And I think we've got a couple of pictures here of just what's possible when you manage at that regime. So nice, clean, sort of a uniform. There's a bit of color variation, but still sort of the Nitens is yeah, just sort of a nice lighter colored um yeah, uniform piece of wood when you peel it and put it in that
That's Dave. I'll just jump into that.
yep.
That photo is really interesting because that's sliced veneer from Britain's, which is a great product, and it's actually what they call mismatch. So they were after a colour variegation in it. A lot of the beautiful Nitons that you guys supply will cut pure white. Yeah, it's an amazing product, but that's actually sliced, not peeled. Yeah.
That's fair enough. And for people that may not understand that process, there are two ways to get veneer. There's a rotary peeled veneer, which basically you put the log on a lathe and a knife comes up and basically unwinds it. But the slicing process up at Britain's is when you cut cants, so call it beams of wood, they get steamed, and then they have a vertical slicer that they just run it through. It's a really neat piece of machinery, and it's the only one in the state. It's worth seeing if you ever get a chance.
Only one left in Australia.
No, there you go.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a great bit of kit. You might talk to this one then, Michael, as well.
Yeah.
You'd be more familiar.
Touchwood's a new product. The if you have a look at that wall paneling, it's brilliant use of Tasmanian veneers to stretch the product. So it's a zero point 0.8 or a 1.1 mil veneer over a backing, but shaped and honestly, as you can see in the photo, very hard to tell it from a piece of native timber or any other lining. So it's great. It's easy to put up 2.4 by 1.2 sheets and other sizes. So Britons have really tried to stretch their resource, especially in the plantation Nitons, in the Shining Gum, Tasash area, into the market.
Cool. So this is probably even more of my area of expertise, the native forest management. That's probably currently core business for STT and definitely core business for the southern region, whose plantation estate is slightly smaller than my northern counterparts. Under the Forest Management Act, we're required to make available 137,000 cubic meters of high quality sawlog a year from the native estate. Um, it's worth noting that every year in the news, you'll hear that that wasn't the actual cut. uh, we're required to make available, which means we have plans and the capability to harvest it. But as you can appreciate in the commodities market, things go up and down, and sometimes customers don't actually want all of that. So there's just, again, a little bit of detail there that the media seems not to be able to cover. The harvest levels are calculated on a sustainable yield. And in fact, for the last little bit, we've sort of been reducing the amount of cut. Uh, Certainly from the Tasmanian Forestry Agreement, things dropped substantially. And I guess, if you've been following the news, just looking at the EPBC implications, we're watching that with a great deal of interest. What's important to note is since 2007, not 1 hectare of native forest has ever been converted to plantation. It's all resown with local genetics in the proportions of the species that were originally growing there. So as an example, if we harvested a coop that had 50% Eucalyptus obliqua, 25% Eucalyptus regnans, and 25% Eucalyptus viminalis, we would collect seed from those species in the local area, if not from the coop itself when we harvested it, which we try and do most of the time. And we would resow those local genetics. It turns out that things like Eucalyptus obliqua, to plant it down in the south, down Catamaran, but if you took seed from the northeast, it probably wouldn't do as well as the local genetics. It appears they're quite particular. And look, it's a different kind of product. It's typically sort of a tighter grown, a little more stable, particularly in the summer. And there's also other species that get harvested during a native forest harvest. So certainly blackwood is one of our more commercial species. Mostly that comes from the northwest, the blackwood swamps, and there's a sort of a sustainable cut associated with that. But it's worth just plugging things like special species or what come from the native forest harvest, either as arisings or targeted partial or selective logging when we want to get sort of some feature wood kind of thing. I think we've got a picture of sort of the seed collection coming up, Claire.
Yeah.
So we run a fairly extensive program. It's quite labor intensive, but we send people out to collect these capsules. And then from there, we run it. We've got 2 kilns in the state that STT runs. We run it through the kilns and separate out the seeds. And so by weight, you get sort of, look, on a good day, you'll get about 3% of that material you see there will turn into seed. And then it really boils down to about the germination rates and what we can use and what we put on. But as a rough figure, we need to be able to put on 1 kilo of seed per hectare of native forest sown. So it's a fairly significant program to keep the seed up to the harvested hectares.
And I thought this was an interesting comparison, Dave, between the sowing of seed in a native forest and what it looks like to go and plant a plantation. Completely different process.
It is completely different, and even in the amount of trees. So a plantation will typically get planted out at a density of, call it 1,100 trees per hectare. And look, that can range between 600 and 900, or 1,600 and 900, but 1,100 is a good number. If you look at some of the literature on what gets naturally reestablished post wildfire, you can expect to see about something on the order of 100,000 seedlings per hectare from the native seed pool. We would typically try to get somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 stems of native forest planted on the same patch of ground when we're reseeding. The idea being is that you just have that more chance of getting genetic winners for the next rotation. Whereas you've already, in the plantation environment, you've already selected your genetic winners, and you're planting just with a bit of a budget in mind. So completely different approaches. Look, this really sums up. You hear the word industrial forestry, but this actually is an industrial forest landscape. Um, Trees right to the horizon. I think it's worth pointing out that you can see it's a total mosaic. You can see 3 or 4 patches there of timber that's been harvested and regrown. What's interesting is that's harvesting isn't the only disturbance that still affects production forestry landscape. So you see all those dead white top trees in the foreground there. That's as a result of wildfire. So we still get the effect of that. So trees don't necessarily die just because they get logged. Trees also get killed from the natural disturbance regime, which ecologically is primarily fire in Tasmania. But in and amongst that, what you can see is some of those trees would be excellent hollow bearing structure for threatened species like the swift parrot. And in fact, you can see a good ridge there, sort of in the medium right-hand side of the picture of some very mature timber, which would also have excellent hollow bearing structure. And in all likelihood, that would be probably a reserve in our landscape. And again, structure for mast owls, swift parrots, potentially eagles, those kind of threatened species that persist and seem to do quite well, despite part of the landscape being devoted to timber production. So just a bit of regulatory understanding. We don't just wander out and say, "Oh, it looks like a good tree. We'll knock it down. We'll put it on a truck and take it back to the mill." There's a fair substantial package of legislation behind what we can and can't do, and that's backed in legislation, things like the Forest Practices Act. There's a code that we're expected to follow, and that sets out sort of the baseline rules for managing special values, which include water, soil protection. So if you imagine highly erodible soil on steep slopes, for example, there's provisions there to make sure that don't create landslips or other untidiness. It's to do with managing threatened species. It's to do with landscape. I think it's also important to understand that in the Tasmanian context, we have an independent regulator, the Forest Practices Authority. They conduct annual audits on us. They also, under the forest practices system, we're required to seek advice from them once things get a little bit tricky, and they have specialists in the in all special values areas, including biodiversity, cultural specialists. So if you think of either Aboriginal heritage or European heritage, landscape, and soil, water, and geology. And geology actually is a bit interesting because for example, we have a huge cave system, karst systems that STT operates on, and indeed does some of the private guys as well. And then, like I said, the law says since 2017, no conversion, but STT or Forestry Tasmania hasn't converted things to plantation since 2007. So the plantation estate that we have is the one we've got to manage right now. The only thing that washes in and out of the system right now is farmland potentially. And if you're paying attention to the news, that can be controversial too. The other sort of beyond the regulator is there's certification systems, which essentially is an independent verification of standards, including and look, some of it's pretty basic if you operate in a first world country, but other countries would struggle to get it. But things like, you actually have legal rights to the timber. Your company addresses things like modern slavery. It has systems in place for, paying workers fairly. But also it's things like accounting for threatened species and accounting for indeed public perception as well, and the level of engagement with the public. That is another, it's voluntary, but you just can't operate in Australia without having certification. And certainly all our customers, the global customers, expect a level of certification. The standard currently that seems to work the best for all most, if not all, forest companies is the PEFC, responsible wood. And that reassures. There's part of that is line 3 there, the chain of custody means that if it's come off our land, we're able to track that wood all the way through to the final board when it shows up in Bunnings, for example. We know it's the same piece of wood that was legally harvested, then legally processed, and it wasn't diluted with other dodgy wood at the mill or something like that. And then it comes out and it goes to customers, so they know when they see it that it's 100% of the way through the chain of being grown and harvested. It's a legal product. So I've touched on a couple of the differences, but look, native forest in terms of establishing it, it's by and large it's sowing. That said, we've sort of entered a space where the importance of maintaining biological legacy sometimes forces us to plant in a native forest environment. And this can be a bit tricky because we're not creating a plantation, but sometimes it's just too tricky to burn around some of the trees that we want to retain. And those could include giant trees or large trees or trees that have been identified as critical habitat for species. But largely we do either naturally or artificially sow with seed in the native forest environment, whereas plantation is strictly a planted regime, and it's usually planted in rows as well to enable future stand tending projects. So again, with the tending of native forest, it can sort of end up being a patchwork, whereas the plantation ideally is just one nice discrete unit. The rotation native forest can range. And I guess, an example I could give you is something with that gets a lot of rainfall and at sea level, you can probably grow a decent sawlog in 60 to 70 years, versus if you get into a high elevation environment where it's colder, maybe a little drier, you've got to grow the tree longer, and that just sort of makes sense. Plantations, similar sort of influence, but really you can sort of get away with it in under 30 years and get a product that you want. Look, the planning unit depends how you want to talk about it, but I think it's fair to say that enough private companies with plantations also manage an estate of native forest that they keep as reserves. And so they need to be given credit for that, even though right at the actual harvest unit or the crop unit, it's sort of just a general monoculture, a uniform stand like we saw in that one of those pictures. Whereas the planning unit for native forest, like that picture of the forest we showed, it's a mosaic. And even at the coop level, it can be very complex and include the retention of large trees and streamside reserves and maybe a reserve around an old sawmill site. And it can be very messy, which isn't a bad thing ecologically. It just can be a bit untidy and complex to manage. And yeah, the products that native forest offer are sort of the higher end stuff. There's no question. It's a more solid, stable wood, definitely appearance grade. And whereas plantation offers, look, it can offer an appearance grade too, as we saw in some of those pictures. But equally, the bulk of it probably is possibly suited to things like engineered mass timber. That said, the higher end of native forest is that appearance grade stuff. Companies down in Tasmania are looking at incorporating sort of the middle ground. So stuff that maybe would have been pulped in previous decades, is actually finding its way into mass engineered timber products as well. So it's about using all of your harvest to the best and highest use of what it can be. So yes, you can certainly get the best of the best out of native forest, but that doesn't mean some of the middle or lower grade logs shouldn't be used for things that plantation is finding its way into as well. So it's not really simple. There's a fair bit of crossover on that one. Michael, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I will, mate. So, interestingly, um, I was part of this. These are some small sections that were taken out and some GLTs taken out during the process of making the St Luke's build. This table and chair was done by John Goulder out of South Australia. And to add to what David said, it's a different look. It's a different product. It's a complementary product to the clearer native. But my word, when it went into the South Australian furniture design, it caused some interest. So there was some genuine interest in Knightons, Tasash. There was definite interest in using material that was destined for the pulp pile into such a beautiful piece of furniture. Okay, so CLT, David spoke about mass timber, and this is a classic example. This is a set of CLT stairs and landings at the River's Edge building in Launceston. They were built by Cusp. I worked there at the time. A beautiful little project. And just as a building edge for the architects that are online, these stairs took 4 hours to put into place. The opposing stairs on the other side of the build in concrete took 7 weeks. So while the unit cost was higher, the installation cost and the installation time was so much lower that when you looked at the cost proposition or the return on investment, that these stairs came out well. They've been in situ for quite a few years now, and they still look as beautiful as the day they went in. Do you want to grab this one, David? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can carry on. So, look, so with native forest harvesting, just a few talking points. It's worth noting that, across Tasmania, 80% of the old growth is protected, but even on the production estate, we've got at STT, we've got sort of a couple of rule sets. One of them is the retention of giant trees with significant reserves around them, and those are trees that are greater than 4 meters in diameter or taller than 85 meters. But in addition to that, we've got something that we're operating under now for the last couple of years is a large tree retention where possible. And look, that results in, I'd be guessing something on the order of 90% of trees greater than 2.5 meters diameter are also retained in situ and carried on to the next rotation. Look, it's worth noting that sometimes you might see a picture of a large tree on the back of a truck and it's a single rider. Just recognize that the bunk width on logging trucks is 2.3 meters. So any tree you see on the back, even if it's a single rider, is actually less than 2.5 just by virtue of the engineering of log trucks. And we have a fairly extensive database of these large trees that now that we're collecting them and mapping them and describing them spatially. We've got a bit of science behind what we do retain. We target any number of special values across the landscape, including giant trees, including threatened species, including vulnerable ground, and put that up into a fairly extensive reserve network. Really only about half of production forest that STT manages, for example, is only eligible for harvesting. The other half is sort of just not touched. And as an example, is we're fairly engaged with things like threatened species management. For example, in the southern region, I would spend something on the order of $250,000 a year searching for eagle nests and then managing them with the appropriate reserves. The reason the bulk of the eagle nests are located on permanent timber production zone land is because we're the only agency in Tasmania that actively looks for them every year. So we've got a fair understanding and a fair database of some of these threatened species. And the final point there is one of the things that a managed forest can give you, and if you think about the way Tasmania is set up, is you've got sort of the World Heritage Area, which on its bulk sits in the southwest corner of Tasmania. Then there's a buffer of production forest, and then you get sort of the hobby farms and urban environments. That managed forest has a network of roads that run through it and bridges that are maintained and paid for. And what that does is on landscape level fires, that gives you options to access. Whereas in the World Heritage Area where there's no roads or anything and management plans prevent you from the use of heavy equipment and other things, you've got a bit more options on a roaded active forest environment and what you can do. So it's worth just recognizing that that gives you an effective fire management environment. So yeah, whereas contrast plantations, again, it certainly can be established on previously cleared land in the agricultural setting, but otherwise the plantation estate is set on a forested environment. The advantage is that they can be grown quicker and come up with the biomass, and if it's processed like things like those mass laminated pictures we just saw, you still get a really decent and attractive solid wood product out of it. Yep, there's a comment about monoculture here, and that in theory is what plantations should be in Tasmania because it's such a productive state. You do actually often end up with bits and pieces of understory and other sort of native bits that are and pieces that are around it. It's also worth noting though that just because the stand of plantation is a monoculture, it doesn't mean the forest around it is. And so that's kind of the way it's managed is the stuff set aside also counts as part of the forest. The real important one here is that the more timber we can grow domestically, in theory, is less timber that we have to import. And I think that really leads into the fact that you'll often hear an argument about if we don't grow it here, you might have to source it from countries whose environmental practices are poorer. And look, there's no question that's definitely the case. But the other one I'd posit is that the alternative also is maybe getting it from different countries that are quite far away, like Canada has a responsible forest management system, and so does Europe, but they're virtually on the other side of the globe. So, I don't know how much bunker fuel you'd need to burn to bring that timber down to Australia to supplement a lack of domestic supply. But I can't see how that contributes positively to the carbon equation either. I mean, it's just the same about buying food local and whatnot. So should your timber. So I guess that's my observation on that subject. And the reality is there's a trade deficit in Australia. We don't supply our own, and so this comment that appears in the media from time to time about the plantation estate is able to supply all we need. Well, that's simply not true, nor is it demonstrable. And it's worth noting that on the back of some MIS schemes where fundamentally plantation trees were established on inappropriate sites, those plantations aren't getting regenerated again. And there's great examples if you drive up the East Coast of where there was hardwood trees planted on dry, just unsuitable farmland. And those plantation estates aren't going back into plantation, they're being returned to rough grazing and pasture. So the comment at the bottom is quite true. In actual fact, A, the plantation estate can't keep up with timber demand for Australia, and B, the plantation estate's shrinking. And this is a new one to me. I thought it was a bit less clear, but I'll go with this one. It's not an insignificant trade deficit. It's pretty darn substantial. So, in terms of sovereignty, national sovereignty, and our ability to take care of ourselves, really got to think about this figure and why we wouldn't continue to responsibly manage with the view of adaptively managing continuous improving, but responsibly manage native forest alongside plantation estate to provide the many things that we use, including architectural specifications.
And the key thing here, Dave, is we import 7 billion. So the trade deficit is 2 billion because
Yeah,
we're
okay, that's right. Yeah,
exporting fiber for wood chips.
yeah,
So
yeah,
if you're looking at timber alone, we're importing $7 billion worth.
yeah. And that's like you say, that's geared towards the solid wood component.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just on that, the what we have noticed just in the woodlands is the ability to recover solid wood actually grows up in a regrowth environment, a regrowth native environment. We do get a higher recovery of solid wood. Um, I, I think obviously there's an investment. What this slide is showing is there's certainly an investment process that's needed in terms of getting trees into the ground. Obviously, if you look at the Rushy Lagoon sort of media content these days, that can be controversial. I think one of the other things, and this is why I'm very really pleased and excited about the Maslam kind of approach, is looking at what else we can do with what we've got existing. One of the products I'm sort of really trying to promote is some of the underutilized species like wattle. So it's a relative of blackwood, and whether if we traditional species that we just haven't used, whether we can start to bring them a little more online and get some niche value out of them. And I think that's another sort of component of responsible forest management, but responsible utilization of forest that is harvested, be it low quality plantation wood or alternate species in the native forest environment, as an example.
This might be one for you, Mick.
Yeah, I think so. And apologies to anyone that hears the background noise. I'm down at sunny Lake Pyman, just waiting for the snow to start. We've got a hell of a rainstorm down here. So, yep, I do apologise. Yeah, look, plantation hardwood shine, as Dave's just said, CLT and glue lambs, engineered floorings, linings, mouldings, jams. If it's a thinned and pruned base log, they're perfect. What we have to learn to do is what to handle the second and third stem. And as you saw in the John Goulder table before, there is a place for it, and it's imagination that's really stopping us going forward. Native hardwood still rules, appearance grade, you know what you're getting every time, fine joinery, feature paneling and things, the more traditional fare in that. But these markets can run side by side. One's complementary to the other. Thanks, Queen. Where to buy it? Britain's Timber, of course. Most of the sawmills in Tasmania are now looking at processing Tas-ash, shining gum. So it's interesting that, Britain's jumped into it very early, but they do have the ability to use veneer and other processes that put them into a leading position, which is great. As David's already said too, Maslam through Western Junction Sawmill, through Australian Sustainable Hardwoods. GLT and glulam beams are their forte, and they're very, very good and make mass amounts of it. So, and out of fibre managed plantations as well as the public estate. Okay, look at the St Luke's building in Launceston. Structure, CLT floors, ceilings, glulam beams. The thing is a paragon of timber and a beautiful build. And have a look at it. It's probably the most sympathetic build that you've seen. We've looked at it in great detail, and there's a lot on the Tas website. Engineered flooring's interesting. We've looked at slicing it. We're now testing it for sports floors. So Tas Ash in the plantation, you know, it's not out of the realms with the right manufacturing that we can put it into the sports floors, and it's a beautiful white timber. So walls and ceilings, as we've looked at. Joinery, if you have a look through some of the UTAS buildings, you'll already see it in there. Exterior is going to be a challenge, but it's being worked on at the moment.
I popped this slide in, and you made the point just a couple of minutes ago, Dave, about maximising the utilisation of what comes out of a native forest. So you've got on the right-hand side there the silver wattle soaring trial that you just mentioned. But I thought it was also worth mentioning the tree fern translocation program. And so that image is in the UTAS Forest Dome, where there are tree ferns. And so the translocation program, which is run by the Forest Practices Authority, they go in and they collect tree ferns and then make them available to go into urban greening projects so that they're not lost during harvesting. So that process of maximising the utilisation of everything and wasting nothing, I think, is really important. So,
Okay.
Mick, do you want to do this one? Yep.
Yeah, 6 things to take away. Forestry is complicated. David's explained that. You know, there's great articulation at the start of this webinar that you can look back on. Timber quality is a direct result of management quality, which is true, but I will say that pulp logs, fibre managed material is still suitable for many products, including mass lamb and others. So don't discount it when you're looking for it. Tasmania is the only plantation estate in Australia managed specifically for high quality timber. I, like David, is the only one that I know of, so that's quite possibly
and
true.
that's been sold as Tasmanian ash currently,
yes,
by
yes.
Britain Timbers, but otherwise it's Tasmanian shining gum.
Yep.
The technical name for it.
Yep. And you can find everything you want on our website shortly. We're putting up all the technical data and that onto the website, so you'll be able to reach in there, look at fire indices and the whole gamut of things. Native and plantation are managed under the same regulation. David brushed on the PEFC and how it works and how it chases through from the coop to the log to the board to the product. And all of the people on our marketing campaign are part of the PEFC certified chain. So both estates are managed with environmental care, goes without saying. I think the key one's number 6. We need both. Demand is rising. Planting has stalled, and Australia imports 7 billion of wood products a year and has done since the 1950s. We've been a net importer of timber. So we've never been able to suffice our own needs. And I think it's critical that we actually work towards doing that with these plantation estates. Don't forget the expert helpline. Any questions on any of these things, 1300 041 761. You'll come through to me, but if there's questions for David, we'll sure pass them on and get him to answer in due course.
And if there are any immediate questions, pop them into the chat for both Dave and Mick now, and they can answer those. You seeing any questions there, Mick?
No,
one
Claire?
maybe there in the chat. Yeah, no. So if there are no further questions, it was lovely to have you all. Thank you for joining us. As Mick said, after the fact, we will put the recording of this up on the Tasmanian Timber website and share that with you through socials and our EDM. But if If you have specific questions for Dave, Mick will pass those along and get answers back to you. But otherwise, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Mick, for generously sharing your time. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, whenever that may be.